One intent of the film is to make it clear that this is not a subject that is so complicated and technical that average people can't understand it or hold political opinions based on what occurred. In fact, it's really quite simple what happened. It was a bank robbery, and it was a bank robbery committed not by somebody walking into a bank with a gun, but committed by the president of the bank.
The defense that was proffered by many of the investment banks was not, "You're wrong." It was, everybody's doing it and everybody knows it's going on, and therefore nobody should rely on these analysts anyway.
I have a couple of friends who were among the earliest people to warn about this crisis. Two of my friends, both of whom appear in the film, actually, they're also professional colleagues of mine from back in my academic days, long ago, are Nouriel Roubini and Charles Morris, both of whom warned about the crisis and the coming of the crisis well before it became publicly known.
And in early 2008, Charles Morris published his book about the impending crisis.
We had a huge boom in housing that made no sense at all. Charles and I have been good friends, and I was sending him chapters to read. And I think he said this. He thought this was really overdone. He said, it's not going to, sure there's going to be some troubles. It's not going to be this bad, because once I told him that the subprime mortgage tranches were selling 20 cents on the dollar. And he said, well, we should buy them. I said, no, no, and he couldn't really believe that. And then as it happened, it didn't roll out precisely as I said, but it actually did. And that's when I think he got very interested in it. And the further he looked, this looked like another big, bad issue, just like war, you know, with almost the same cost and so forth.
We engaged in a really quite massive research project. And for that, I read an enormous amount of stuff myself. I talked to an enormous number of people myself. I called upon my various friends and colleagues from academic and policy days. I thought that this was probably a non-makeable film because the topic is so abstract. With the first film, it was about war. You could break it up with these great shots of tanks and so forth. And I had no doubts about how smart Charles is, and I'd seen him make a really good film right out of the box. And he did this one just about right. When the first time I saw a rough cut, I thought, damn, he actually did it.
The investment banks fueled a massive bubble in internet stocks, which was followed by a crash in 2001 that caused $5 trillion in investment losses.
Well, the United States, for a 45-year period after the end of the Great Depression, did not have a single financial crisis. And the principal reason for that was the financial services industry was very tightly regulated. Those regulations were removed progressively beginning in the 1980s. And beginning in the 1980s, the United States began having financial crises.
The real difference here is that in past times, the regulatory bodies conceived as their job to lean against that kind of thing. Whenever you see something frothy start, even if you didn't know why, at some point you just lean back. You raised interest rates, you increased capital rules, or something like that. This time, for the first time, regulators cheered it on. I mean, they thought this was the coming state of God's kingdom.
There were two of them in the late 1980s. There was the stock market break of 1987, and then the savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s, which at the time was regarded as a horrific, catastrophic event because it ended up costing the taxpayers about $125 billion, which now seems quaint by comparison with what has recently occurred. Then there were two more in the late 1990s, and now we have this one.
So help me God.
By the time George W. Bush took office in 2001, the U.S. financial sector was vastly more profitable, concentrated, and powerful than ever before. Dominating this industry were 5 investment banks, 2 financial conglomerates, 3 securities insurance companies, and 3 rating agencies.
it's really not that complicated. The details are complicated because it's a complicated industry, but the underlying principles are really very simple. And in fact, one point that I think really has not been made sufficiently frequently about this crisis and the issues in general is, even if you didn't do a single thing about increasingly stringent regulation of financial practices, if you were to put 75 senior financial executives in jail for the rest of their lives, I have a funny feeling that financial crises would become less frequent.
$600 million of Timberwolf securities is what you sold. Before you sold them, this is what your sales team were telling to each other. Boy, that Timberwolf was one deal.
If I, Charles Ferguson, just kind of went around defrauding people, I would be arrested and I'd be put in jail. And it's really quite astonishing that none of these people have been put in jail. And it's a contrast to what used to happen. In the 1980s, during the savings and loan crisis, several thousand financial executives were put in prison for looting their companies. And the change between then and now is very distressing.
I think when I first looked at it about 2001, 2002, there was $1 trillion in credit default swaps, or $500 billion, which sounded pretty big. 3 years later, there was 40 trillion, and I thought, oh, there's going to be a crash.
The way that a depression was avoided was by spending several $1 trillion, and we can't keep spending at that level. At some point, the United States is going to have to begin earning its way.
The financial industry spent over $5 billion on lobbying and campaign contributions.
Now, in order to get out of the crisis, the administration has been pushing the same thing. Let's get people back to buying houses, consumer credit, and buying cars, because now the government owns the cars. And we have to face up at some point to that's the wrong thing. We have to shift the economy from one that was 71% driven, the whole GDP was 71% personal consumption in the first quarter of 2007, I think. And we have to get that back down to 65 or 63 or something like that, with the difference going into savings and investment and useful stuff that's very boring, won't be good for the housing industry and so forth. And you can't quickly convert Walmart clerks into Caterpillar workers. You know? So there's a painful readjustment we're going through. And what we've been doing is kind of putting that off.
I personally am deeply disappointed with how President Obama and the Obama administration have handled this situation. And I think that disappointment is actually widely shared, and I think that it's growing. And I think that we see evidence of that not just in continuing public anger about the financial crisis and the way that it was handled, and the fact that no one's been called to account with regard to it, but also increasingly people are making parallels between the way the financial crisis was handled and the way the Obama administration is handling other major crises and issues. Of course, the most obvious current example being the oil spill. And there, too, there was a long period of deregulation, and there, too, a lot of cronyism, and there, too, an accident waiting to happen that finally did, and there, too, so far at least, no one has been called to account, and there, too, a lot of innocent, poor people are suffering greatly, and nothing has been done to relieve their suffering.
In terms of current dollars, nothing's come close to the Great Depression. That was pretty much 10 long years when unemployment hit 25%. Now, if we kept numbers the same way, now we'd be close to 25% unemployment now, too. But still, even with our not very good social safety net, there's a lot more cash keeps flowing now than it did in the 1920s. But other than that, I think it ranks, it's probably the second worst that we've had in the history of the Republic. I mean, it's really that bad. I do think that we have to get into the budget balancing kind of thing. I think we don't have to rush into it. We could certainly have, you know, extended unemployment benefits for 5 more months without causing the end of the Western world.
Things are so tough. There's a lot of people out there, and pretty soon you're going to be seeing more camps like this around because there's just no jobs right now.
This is the question of the historical impact and large-scale, long-run impact and meaning of this crisis is that this could indeed be something that signals and has a major role in causing the economic decline of the United States.
Enough people will probably see this film and understand what these guys did, that including members of Congress, that they will be watching the banks like a hawk for the next 5, 7, 8 years. I think this film will do as much for that cause as almost anything else that you could have done.
I hope that the film will cause people to think about how they vote and which candidates they contribute money to. And America and American politics seems to be somewhat paralyzed now, and we shall see whether any real progress is made in these domains. But that, luckily, is not the subject of my film.
They will tell us that we need them, and that what they do is too complicated for us to understand. They will tell us it won't happen again. They will spend billions fighting reform. It won't be easy. But some things are worth fighting for.